The Grand Convocation Hall of the Vorith Imperium was the largest room Elias Vaughn had ever stood in. The walls stretched upward for hundreds of feet, carved from black stone pulled from the cores of dead planets. Lights floated near the ceiling like trapped stars, cold and blue, casting long shadows across the rows of alien delegates who filled every seat in the hall. More than 300 species sat in tiered rows that curved around a wide central floor. Some had 4 arms. Some had no arms at all. Some breathed through slits in their necks, and the sound of all that breathing together filled the room like wind moving through a deep cave. Every one of them had come to watch the same thing, the classification of a new species into the Vorith tier scale. That new species was human. Elias walked through the main gate alone. He wore no armor. He carried no weapon. He had one small data chip tucked in his coat pocket and a translation collar fastened around his neck, and that was everything he had brought to the most powerful court in the known galaxy. The Vorith guards at the entrance had looked at him, then looked past him for the rest of his delegation, and when they saw there was no one else behind him, they had exchanged a long, slow glance with each other. The floor of the hall was made from polished white stone, and Elias's boots made a clean, sharp sound with every step. Every delegate in the room could hear him walking. The sound was small against all that enormous space, but it carried clearly from one end of the hall to the other. The Vorith High Council sat at the far end on a raised platform. There were 7 of them, each dressed in robes of deep violet that trailed all the way down the wide steps of the platform. Their skin was pale silver, and their eyes were large and very dark, built by nature for reading emotion from a great distance. They were old, all of them, and they carried the kind of stillness that comes from spending many decades making decisions that shaped billions of lives. The council leader, High Magistrate Dravan, looked down at Elias with an expression that was almost bored. He had done this hundreds of times before, welcomed new species, read their classification scores aloud, and sent them away with their new assigned place in the order of things. He had never once found it very interesting. To his right sat Princess Saravith Vorith, first heir of the Imperium. She was tall, even seated, with 4 thin arms folded neatly in her lap. Her robes were silver white, and her hair, if it could truly be called hair, was a cluster of fine dark filaments that moved slightly even when the air around her was completely still. She had a reputation in the court for being sharp and cold and precise in everything she said. She had watched hundreds of species enter this hall over the years, and she had never once stayed quiet when there was something cutting she could say. But when Elias Vaughn walked to the center of the white floor and stopped and looked up at the council without any trace of fear, Saravith went completely silent. Her chief attendant, a small round-bodied creature named Voss who sat just behind her left shoulder, noticed this immediately. Voss had served the princess for 11 years and had never once seen her go quiet at the opening of a classification hearing. He leaned slightly forward to look at her face more closely. Her secondary eyes were open. Most Vorith kept their secondary eyes closed in public settings. These eyes were small, set just beneath the main pair, and they were not used for ordinary sight, they were used for reading. They picked up biological signals, the heat of blood moving under skin, the small trembling of tense muscle, the chemical traces of emotion that drifted off a living body like heat off warm ground. Using them openly was considered intimate and vulnerable. It was not something a princess did in the middle of a formal court session with hundreds of watching eyes. But Saravith's secondary eyes were fixed on Elias, and they did not move. On the floor below, Elias had no idea any of this was happening. He was looking up at the High Council the way a tired man looks at a long road he has already decided to walk, steady, patient, and completely without hurry. High Magistrate Dravan had begun the formal opening speech, listing the date, the name of the session, the species under review. His voice filled the hall easily. It was a voice that had been trained for filling large spaces. He called humanity a newly contacted primitive civilization from a single planet origin point. He read out Earth's location in careful official language. He noted that the species had shown limited interstellar capability and no formal governance structure beyond regional scale. All of it was read directly from a prepared document, and his tone did not change once throughout. Elias listened without changing his expression. A delegate from the Kurath block, a wide-bodied species with thick armored shoulders, leaned toward his neighbor and said something under his breath. His neighbor made a sound that was clearly laughter in any language. Several others nearby did the same. The joke was about the human coming without a delegation, walking in with nothing but a collar and a data chip. It was not a kind joke. The translation collar delivered every word directly into Elias's ear. He did not react. That was the exact moment when Saravatha's secondary eyes opened wider. She had expected fear. Every species that entered this hall for the first time carried fear. She could read it as clearly as she could read color with her main eyes. Even the large species brought it. Even the proud and armored ones. It lived underneath their display, honest and biological. The hall itself was built to create that feeling. The height of the ceiling, the cold lights, the weight of 300 watching species pressing down from every side. But what came off Elias Vaughn was not fear. It was not bravado either. She had read bravado many times and it always smelled like fear dressed in a different coat. This was something else entirely. There was real tiredness in him, deep tiredness, the kind that comes from a very long journey and too many mornings that started before the sun was up. There was care, she could feel it clearly, some quiet, steady weight of care directed towards something that was not inside this room at all. And underneath all of it, sitting still like a stone at the bottom of a clear river, there was something she had no good word for. It was not confidence in the way the Vorith understood confidence. Their kind of confidence was always loud in the body, wider posture, higher heat, a forward pressure like something leaning into the wind. This was not loud. It was quiet in the way that only very solid things are quiet. It was more like standing near a wall that has been standing for a very long time and does not feel any need to announce that it is still there. Voss leaned close to the princess and whispered, "Should I prepare the standard dismissal remarks for after the vote?" Saravath said nothing. Dravan finished the opening speech and gestured toward Elias, signaling the moment for the standard opening statement from the species under review. Most species gave long speeches full of praise for the Imperium and careful requests for mercy in their scoring. Elias looked up at the High Council, and in plain clear words that his collar delivered without decoration, he said, "My name is Elias Vaughn. Earth sent me here to introduce ourselves. We are glad to meet you." That was everything. The hall was silent for one long moment. Then the murmuring started, moving through the delegate seats like water running fast downhill. 300 species reacting to the shortest opening statement in the recorded history of the Convocation Hall. High Magistrate Dravan blinked slowly, a Vorith expression of mild confusion, and moved on to the next item in his prepared agenda. But Saravath did not move on. She sat very still with her secondary eyes open and her forearms folded in her lap, and she watched the human standing alone on the white floor below, and she turned that quiet wall feeling over and over in her mind, trying to find a clean word for it. She did not find one that day. But the fact that she was still looking, that was already something new. In 11 years of working beside her, Voss had never once seen the princess fail to find a word for something she was reading. He wrote a small private note to himself that night and folded it into the back of his record book. The note said only, "Asterisk the human is different asterisk." He underlined it twice. The medical chambers beneath the Convocation Hall were not built for comfort. They were built for accuracy. The walls were lined with scanning equipment that hummed at a low steady frequency, the kind that sat in the chest rather than in the ears. The lights were white and extremely bright. Everything smelled of cold metal and something sharper underneath, something with no name in any human language. 2 Vorith bioanalysts were waiting when Elias arrived. They were both in grey uniforms, and they carried data boards in their hands, and neither of them looked particularly interested. This was routine work for them. A new species scan took 20 minutes at most. They would record the results, flag the low scores, write a short report, and go home for the evening. They gestured for Elias to stand in the center of the scanning ring. He stood there without complaint. The ring was a circle of tall metallic frames, each one embedded with hundreds of small sensor nodes that pulsed faintly with pale light. The scan worked in layers, first the outer body, then deep tissue, then neural structure, then biochemistry, and finally the emotional resonance reading that placed a species on the tier scale's biological ranking. The first analyst activated the sequence and leaned back against the wall to wait. The scan ran for 30 seconds and then stopped. Not finished. Stopped. An error tone sounded from the main panel. The first analyst frowned and walked to the panel. He checked the settings, found nothing wrong, and restarted the scan from the beginning. It stopped again at roughly the same point. The second analyst came forward now, and they both stood at the panel looking at the data. There was data. The problem was not that the scanner had found nothing. The problem was that what it had found did not fit the output format. Numbers were appearing in columns that were supposed to stay empty. The emotional resonance reading was trying to map onto the tier scale graph, and the line it was drawing kept going past the edge of the display. The first analyst manually expanded the graph range. The line kept going. He expanded it again. Elias stood in the ring and watched them work and said nothing. He was very used to waiting. The scan took 1 hour and 43 minutes. By the end, both analysts had been joined by 3 more colleagues who had been called down from other floors. All 5 of them stood around the main panel, speaking quickly to each other in low voices, pointing at different parts of the data, pulling up comparison files from past scans to hold against what they were seeing. What they were seeing was not easy to explain. Elias Vaughan's body told a story that their equipment was not designed to read cleanly. He had scars. The scanner mapped them in detail, from injuries that their medical database said should have been fatal. A long blade wound across the side of his body that had somehow closed without full organ loss. A decompression injury from deep space that should have left permanent brain damage. A cardiac event. His own heart had stopped and been forced back, and yet here he stood, warm and breathing and patient, with a heart that showed no lasting weakness. The recovery notes in his file said, *method unknown. Body-directed repair. *. One of the analysts whispered, "Body-directed repair is not a Tier 9 classification feature." Nobody answered him. The neural scan was the part that took the longest. The equipment kept trying to separate out different signal types in Elias's brain activity, and kept finding that the signals it expected to be separate were running together. The Vorath brain processed fear in one region and decision-making in another. These were clean and distinct. In Elias, fear and forward action were firing at the same time in the same space, tangled together so thoroughly that the scanner could not pull them apart. The second analyst pulled up the comparative files for every species they had scanned in the past 3 years. In all of them, fear signals caused a measurable delay in action signals. The body needed a moment to manage the fear before it could move forward. That delay was logged as a standard feature of most biological life. In Elias, there was no delay. Fear and movement were the same event. One analyst quietly added a flag to the file. *subject does not process fear as a stopping signal. Fear appears to function as a fuel source. No known parallel in existing records. The emotional resonance read was last, and it was the one that made the room go very quiet. The tier scale measured emotional range on a spectrum from 1 to 40. Tier 1 species, the most advanced, typically scored between 30 and 35. Tier 9 species, where humanity was expected to land, scored between 4 and 8. A score below 4 indicated a species that primarily operated on instinct with very little complex emotional architecture. Elias scored 51. The number sat on the screen and no one spoke for a while. One of the analysts finally said, very carefully, that the equipment might be malfunctioning. Another said the calibration might need to be reset. A third said nothing. She just kept looking at the number. What the scan had found, if the number was accurate, was not simply a wide emotional range. The scan read depth too. It measured how far each emotional signal went into the body, how long it lasted, how it connected to other signals. What it found in Elias was a whole internal world running at full strength at all times. Grief and hope sitting right next to each other without cancelling each other out. Love that registered in the blood chemistry and the muscle response and the bone density all at once, as if the whole body was involved in it. A capacity for care so deeply wired into the physical structure that removing it would have changed the shape of the man completely. One analyst added the last flag to the file. Emotional architecture does not map onto existing tier framework. Recommend full review before classification vote is cast. The report was sealed and sent upward to the High Council. Dravan read it, frowned at it, and sent it to the classification committee with a note attached. Likely equipment error. Proceed with scheduled vote. But there was one more person the report was sent to. Princess Saravath received it in her private chamber 2 floors above the medical wing. She read it once quickly, then sat back, and then read it again slowly from the beginning. She was still reading when Voss knocked on the door to remind her that dinner was in 30 minutes. She told him to cancel dinner. She read the file 3 more times. She pulled up the comparison files herself and laid them side by side on her display wall. She looked at the gap between every other species ever scanned and the number sitting at the bottom of Elias Vaughan's file. Then she sent a formal message to the High Council using the oldest legal language in the Vorath Code. She was invoking the royal right of postponement. Under this right, which had not been used in over 200 years, the classification vote could not proceed until the first heir had conducted a private formal audience with the species under review. Dravan read the message and said a word that was not appropriate for formal records. 3 senior council members sent messages to each other asking if the princess had perhaps been working too hard lately. Voss, reading the outgoing message over Saravatha's shoulder, felt a small chill move through him, the kind of chill that comes when something very large is beginning to change and you are close enough to feel the first movement. In his quarters on the lower guest floor, Elias Vaughan was eating a ration pack from his bag and writing a message home to his daughter. He did not know about the medical results. He did not know about the emergency legal motion. He did not know that the most powerful woman in 40 star systems had cancelled her dinner and spent 2 hours reading a file with his name on it. He finished his message, sealed it for transmission, and went to sleep. He had always been good at sleeping before important days. It was one of the things the scanner had flagged too. His rest cycle was deep and efficient in a way that their biological model said was not possible under high stress conditions. Another note had been quietly added at the bottom of the file, almost as an afterthought. It said, *, this organism does not appear to recognize when it is supposed to be afraid. *. It was not a criticism. The analyst who wrote it had stared at it for a long moment before deciding to leave it in. It read more like a warning. The private diplomatic chamber was a small room by the standards of the Vorath Imperium. The table in the center was long and dark, made from a wood that no longer existed anywhere in the 40 systems, taken from a tree on a planet that the Imperium had absorbed 3 centuries ago. The chairs on one side were built for Vorath body shape, tall and narrow with rests for 4 arms. On the other side there was one plain chair that had been brought up from storage for Elias, smaller and slightly out of place against the grand furniture around it. There were no guards inside the room. This was a formal audience chamber, and by the ancient rules of the postponement right, no weapons and no witnesses were permitted within the walls. What both parties said here was private. What both parties said here was also, by a technicality that Saravath was aware of and did not mention, recorded by the intelligence office through a sensor in the ceiling. Elias sat down in the plain chair and looked at the table. Saravath entered from a side door, took a seat directly across from him, and looked at him the way someone looks at a question they have been trying to answer for a long time. She did not open with greetings. She said, "You came here alone." It was not a question, but Elias answered it like one. "Yes," he said. Earth only had one ship fast enough to get here in time for the session date. It was mine. "You could have rescheduled the session date," she said. "We could have," he said. "But I did not want to make the crew miss more time with their families for a meeting that might not lead anywhere." Saravath was quiet for a moment. She was looking at him with her secondary eyes open. She had decided before entering this room that she was not going to pretend to look away. "Most species send their largest delegation to a classification hearing," she said. "They bring officials and guards and display pieces. They want to appear strong." "We thought about that," Elias said. "But I figured if the decision is already being made about us before anyone meets us, sending a crowd of people in shiny uniforms is not going to change the decision. Better to just show up and be honest." She looked at him carefully. "And if being honest does not help you?" He thought about that for a second. "Then at least we did not waste everyone's time pretending to be something we are not," he said. Saravath leaned forward slightly. "I have read your medical file," she said. Elias nodded slowly. He did not look surprised or embarrassed. "I figured they would run a scan," he said. "The scan results were unusual," she said. She kept her voice level and official, but she watched his face closely for the reaction. He gave a small shrug of his shoulders, a gesture she had looked up after the first day because she was not sure what it meant. She now knew it was a human expression, for this is a fact I have accepted and carry with me without much drama. "I have had a few hard years," he said simply. "The file says your heart stopped," she said. "It did," he said. "And you recovered." "I did." "How?" she asked. She did not dress the question up. She wanted to know. Elias looked at the ceiling for a moment. "I had people waiting for me at home," he said. "My daughter was 12. It seemed wrong to go." It was not a medical answer. Saravath knew it was not a medical answer, but she had reviewed enough of the scan data to understand that for this species, it might actually be a biological one. She changed direction. "I want to ask you about the scan results," she said. "The emotional resonance reading was outside our scale." "Is that bad?" he asked. "It is confusing," she said. The scale does not go that high. We have never needed it to. What does the scale usually measure? He asked. She explained the tier scale to him clearly and without softening it, the way species were ranked, the way higher emotional range was associated with higher intelligence and capacity for complex civilization, the way lower scores meant a species was considered to need protection and guidance from more advanced civilizations. She expected him to be upset by this. Most species were upset when the scale was explained to them directly. Elias listened all the way to the end without interrupting. So a low score means you manage us, he said. That is one way to describe it, she said. And a high score means we sit at the table ourselves. Also accurate, she said. He nodded slowly. What does a score above the table mean? He asked. Saravith did not have a ready answer for that. It was not a question the scale had been designed to address. She was quiet for a moment. It has not come up before, she said, finally. Elias reached into his coat pocket and placed the data chip on the table. He slid it across toward her. I brought this, he said. I was going to give it to the council, but they did not ask for it. You can have it instead. She picked it up and looked at it. What is on it? She asked. Things humans have made, he said. Medicines that work on diseases we found in your border world records. We solved 2 of them, we think. Engineering designs for water systems that can work in low-gravity environments. Some stories. Some music. He paused. We are not a rich civilization. We do not have a lot of ships or a lot of territory. But we make things, and we figured if we were coming here to introduce ourselves, we should bring something to share instead of just asking for things. Saravith looked at the chip in her hand for a long time. She thought of the hundreds of species she had watched walk into the convocation hall over the years. Some had brought tribute, physical gifts designed to impress. Some had brought legal arguments and formal requests. Some had brought nothing but rehearsed speeches full of flattery aimed at the council. Not one had ever brought something to share. She set the chip down carefully on the table in front of her. What does humanity want from the Imperium? She asked. This was the question at the center of every classification hearing, spoken or unspoken. Elias thought about it honestly. To be known, he said. To be treated as what we are, not what your scale says we should be. To have the chance to be useful in a galaxy that is bigger than any one civilization. He looked at her steadily. We are not asking for power. We are not asking to be ranked above anyone. We just want to be real to you. The room was quiet. Saravith looked at him across the long dark table and felt something shift in her chest, a feeling she was not accustomed to and could not immediately name. She had spent her whole life inside the logic of the tier scale. She had grown up believing that worth could be measured, that rank was natural, that the order of things existed because it reflected some deep truth about how life was arranged. But Elias Vaughn did not fit the order. And he was not fighting the order. He was simply sitting here, tired from a long journey, with a chip full of things his people had made and wanted to share, and he was asking to be real. She finally said the question she had been holding back since the first moment she saw him walk into the hall. Are all humans like you? She asked. He almost smiled. It was a tired smile, the kind that comes from a long history of a particular truth. I am pretty average, actually, he said. Saravith stood. The audience was at its formal end. She gathered herself, pulled her robe straight, and moved toward the side door. She stopped with her hand on the frame. Without turning around, she said, very quietly, I will review the chip tonight. Take your time, Elias said. She went through the door and walked down the corridor and into her private chamber and sat down at her desk without removing her robes. Her hands, all 4 of them, she placed flat on the table in front of her, and she noticed that they were trembling very slightly. Voss knocked and entered behind her. He looked at her hands and then at her face. He had been her attendant for 11 years and he had never seen her hands tremble. Are you well? He asked. I am thinking, she said. About the human? He asked. She looked at the data chip she had carried in from the chamber. About everything, she said. About the scale. About what we measure and what we do not measure and what we have been missing because we never had the right tools to see it. Voss was quiet for a moment. Then, carefully, he said, What have we been missing? Saravith turned the chip over in her fingers. I am not completely sure yet, she said. But I think it is something important. The grand convocation hall was full again. Every delegate had returned to their seat. The air hummed with conversation, low and quick, the way conversation sounds when something unexpected is about to happen and everyone knows it but nobody will say it out loud. The night before, word had spread through the hall's inner corridors that Princess Saravith had invoked the royal right of postponement. This was the piece of news that travelled fastest. The right had not been used in over 200 years, and it had never once been used for a Tier 9 classification. Senior delegates had spent the night sending messages to each other, pulling up old legal records, and arguing about what it meant. The general conclusion was that it meant nothing. The princess was young, occasionally eccentric, and the vote would go forward exactly as planned. High Magistrate Dravan took his seat and called the hall to order. His voice was flat and professional and left no room for drama. He recapped the classification hearing, summarized the bioscan results with the official note that the anomalous readings were likely equipment variants, and moved directly to the vote. He called it formally, Classification of Species Designation Human, Origin Planet Earth, under the Vorith tier scale. All council members in favor of Tier 9 primitive classification will signal now. 5 of the 7 council members signaled immediately. 1 hesitated, looking sideways at Saravith. Saravith had not moved. Dravan looked at her. First Heir, your signal is required to complete the vote. The hall was very quiet. Saravith stood up. This was not normal procedure. Council members signaled from their seats. Standing was a different thing entirely. Standing meant a formal address. Standing meant invoking a process, not simply casting a vote. Half the hall leaned forward without realizing it. I am not signaling, Saravith said. Her voice was calm and very clear. I am instead invoking the Edict of Assessment Challenge under Article 7 of the Founding Charter. The hall erupted. Dravan raised one hand for silence. It took a while to come. When the noise finally dropped enough, he said, with the controlled patience of someone managing a very large headache, First Heir, the Assessment Challenge Edict has not been invoked since the 2nd century of the Imperium. It requires documented evidence of a fundamental failure in the assessment instrument, Saravith said. I have that evidence. I have prepared a full brief and it is being distributed to every delegate in this hall right now. Voss, standing at the edge of the platform, pressed a control on his databoard, and every screen in the hall lit up with the same document. The noise started again, louder this time. Dravan sat back in his chair with an expression that had moved past headache and arrived somewhere near genuine alarm. Saravith waited. She was good at waiting when she needed to be. She had spent most of the night preparing what she was about to say, and she was not going to rush it. When the hall quieted enough, she began. The tier scale was created 400 years ago, she said. It was built on a sample of 62 species. At the time, that was every known species in the surveyed territory. It was an excellent instrument for its time, and it has served the Imperium well. I am not standing here to say it is wrong. I am standing here to say that it is incomplete. A delegate from the Kurath block shouted an objection from his seat. Saravith looked at him with an expression so steady that he sat back down. She continued. The tier scale measures 3 things: biological complexity, emotional range, and technological output. It does not measure recovery. It does not measure depth. It does not measure what a species does when the odds are completely against them. She brought up the bioscan data on the hall's main display. This is the scan taken yesterday of the human representative, Elias Vaughn. I want to walk this court through what it shows. She started with the scars. She named each injury on the record, stated the Vorith medical assessment of its severity, and stated the outcome. She did this without commentary, just fact after fact after fact, laid in a row, each one landing in the silence of the hall like a stone dropped into still water. Then she moved to the neural data. She showed the display that mapped fear and forward action firing simultaneously. She showed the comparison data from every other species on record. She showed the gap. Every other species we have ever scanned shows a delay between fear signal and action signal, she said. The body takes time to manage fear before it can move. This is universal in our data, or it was, until yesterday. In this human, fear does not cause delay. Fear causes acceleration. Their own biology uses fear as an engine, not a warning. The hall was very quiet now. She brought up the emotional resonance score. She let the number sit on the screen without speaking for a long moment. 51, she said. Our scale ends at 40. We have never needed it to go higher. Until now. She paused. I want to be clear about what a score of 51 means in practical terms. It means this species carries a range of internal experience that our instruments cannot fully contain. Grief and hope coexisting without cancelling each other. Love wired into bone and blood chemistry and muscle response, not as a passing state, but as a structural feature of the body itself. A Tier 1 delegate from the far end of the hall stood. First Air, with great respect, this is a single individual. One scan is not a species profile. You are correct, Saravath said, and the delegate looked surprised that she agreed so readily. It is one scan. But I have also reviewed the data chip that Representative Vaughan brought to this session. She held it up so the hall could see it. On this chip are medical solutions for 2 diseases that have been active in our border worlds for over a century. Our own researchers have not solved them. The humans did, unprompted, and they brought the solutions here to share freely, without a trade agreement, without a formal request, without any guarantee that this court would receive them well. She lowered the chip. I also listened to one of their musical compositions last night, she said, and her voice changed slightly, less formal, more honest. I do not have the vocabulary to describe it properly, but it did something in my chest that I have never felt before, and I have been alive for 43 years and studied 400 species. The Curath delegate stood again. This is sentiment, not science, he said. The classification procedure does not exist to be moved by music. The classification procedure exists to accurately assess a species, Saravath said. And I am telling this court that our current instrument is not doing that. We were going to classify humanity as Tier 9, protected primitive. We were going to place them under our management as if they were children who could not govern themselves. She looked across the whole hall. I have now read the scan, listened to the data chip, and sat in a room alone with their representative for an hour. I want this court to hear me clearly. She looked down at Elias in the visitor gallery. He was watching her with that same expression, the quiet one, the steady one, the one the scan had flagged and the analyst had called patient certainty. We were going to protect humanity, she said. I believe humanity has been quietly protecting itself, and everything around it, for longer than our empire has existed. We were going to rank them below us. I am asking this court to consider whether our scale is even designed to rank them at all. She straightened fully to her height. The question before us is not what tier we assign to this species. The question is whether we are wise enough, and humble enough, to ask them to sit beside us rather than beneath us. The hall broke open. It was not applause and it was not protest. It was the sound of hundreds of species reacting at the same time in hundreds of different ways. 3 Tier 1 delegates stood and walked out in formal objection. A cluster of mid-tier delegates were shouting at each other. Several were reading the bioscan document on their screens and saying nothing at all. Dravan was on his feet, calling for order, and the order was slow to come. In the gallery, Elias sat still and watched. The delegate next to him, a 6-limbed observer from a neutral system, leaned over and said, "Are you not going to react to any of this?" Elias looked at the chaos below, the arguing delegates, the walking out protests, the shouted objections, the slow spreading silence as more and more delegates read the document and went quiet. "It is going the way it needed to go," he said. The delegates stared at him. "It is chaos down there." Elias nodded. "That means they are thinking," he said. "Thinking is good." The delegate looked at him for a long time and then looked back at the floor below and decided he did not fully understand humans yet but was very interested in learning. The vote did not go the way Saravath had hoped. She had known it would not. Empires do not turn in a single session. They are too large, too old, too deeply set in their ways. When the shouting in the hall finally died down and the formal vote was called again, 3 council members switched their signals, but 3 held firm, and the result was a deadlock. A deadlock in the Vorith classification system meant automatic referral to a special committee. The committee would take months, possibly years. What it did not mean was a Tier 9 classification. That door, at least, had been closed. And in its place, after 4 hours of argument and formal legal counterfiling, Dravan announced a temporary ruling with barely hidden frustration. Humanity was to receive provisional independent status. It was the first time that classification had ever been granted to a species with fewer than 12 established colonies. It was almost nothing by the scale of what the Imperium could give. It was everything in terms of what it actually meant. Earth governed itself.
No Imperium oversight.
No Vorath Corporation could file a resource extraction claim against the planet. No management protocol could be imposed. A small hard door, barely open, but open. When Elias walked out of the convocation hall into the alien afternoon, the sky above was three colors at once: pale green near the horizon, deep blue overhead, and a thin band of orange running between them where the atmosphere changed density. It was not a human sky. It was beautiful in a way that took adjusting to. He sat down on the wide stone steps outside the hall and looked at the three-colored sky and breathed for a moment without doing anything else. Saravith came out of the side entrance and walked across to where he was sitting. She sat beside him, not at a formal distance but close, the way one person sits next to another person when the ceremony is over. She had removed the outer layer of her robes and folded it over her arm, and without it she looked younger and slightly less imperial. "You are not celebrating," she said. "I am," he said. "This is how I celebrate." She considered this. Sitting quietly on steps. "We came here with nothing and we are leaving with a door that was not open before," he said. "That is worth sitting with for a minute." Saravith looked at the three-colored sky too. "The committee will take a long time," she said. "The full status question will not be resolved quickly." "I know," he said. "You are not frustrated by that." He shook his head slowly. "Frustration does not open doors faster," he said. "We will keep being who we are, and the committee will take the time it takes, and eventually the right answer will be obvious to enough people." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Do you truly believe humanity will be all right out here, in a galaxy this big, with this many civilizations that have not decided what to think of you yet?" Elias looked up at the sky. He did not hesitate. "Yes," he said. "Why?" she asked. She genuinely wanted to know. It was not a test question. It was a real one, asked by someone sitting with him on stone steps after a long day. He thought about it honestly. "Because we have been in situations that looked impossible before," he said. "We have a very long history of being the smallest thing in a very large problem and figuring it out anyway. Not because we are the strongest. We are not the strongest. But we do not quit, and we do not stop caring about the people we are doing it for." He paused. "And we have been alone for a long time. We are very good at working with what we have." Saravith turned the data chip over in one of her hands. She had carried it out of the hall without thinking, the way you carry something that has become important to you without fully realizing it yet. "I will make sure the medical solutions on this chip reach the border world health programs," she said. "Without attribution fees. Without trade terms. Your people offered them freely, and they will be received freely." Elias nodded. "Thank you," he said. Simply and directly, without formality. "Thank you," she said back. It was not a formal return. It was genuine. She meant it for the chip, and for the conversation in the chamber, and for the thing he had done by simply being exactly what he was in front of the entire court. He stood up after a while, picked up his travel bag from where it sat beside him on the step, and turned to go. He had a long trip home. His daughter had sent him 6 messages while the session was running, and he owed her a phone call more than he owed anyone anything else in the galaxy. Saravith stayed sitting on the steps. "Elias Vaughn," she said. He turned. "The word," she said. "The one I could not find for what I read in you that first day in the hall." She looked at him. "I found it this morning. I went through the human linguistic files on your data chip." "What is it?" he asked. "Patient certainty," she said. He smiled at that, a real smile, the kind that uses the eyes too. "That is a good way to put it," he said. Then he turned and walked down the steps toward the transport bay, and the three-colored sky was above him, and he was already composing the first words of the phone call home in his head. 40 years move through the galaxy the way 40 years always do, slowly for the ones living them and quickly for everyone looking back. Earth built 6 more colonies in that time. Not one of them was granted by the Imperium. Every single one was built by human hands on rocks and ice and terrain that no one else had wanted, using engineering techniques that humans had developed themselves and then quietly shared with any neighboring species who asked. 2 diseases that had plagued Vorith border worlds for over a century disappeared from the medical records within 12 years of that first data chip being processed into the border world health programs. There was no official human credit listed in the Vorith health archives. The humans did not ask for any. The tier scale was revised 3 times in 40 years. Each revision made the instrument more nuanced, more wide-ranging, more honest about what it did not know. Each revision could be traced back, through formal legal records, to the Saravath Assessment Challenge and the precedent it had set. The Special Committee delivered its final recommendation in the 14th year. Humanity received full independent status. Not Tier 1. The political machinery was still not ready for that, and humanity did not push for it. Full independent status was enough. It meant a seat at the table. It meant a real door. Saravath became Empress in the 22nd year. She kept the data chip from that first day in a small holder on her desk, not as a relic and not as decoration, but as a working reminder of something she had written in her private journal on the night of the classification hearing. Asterisk, what we do not know how to measure is not the same as what does not exist. Asterisk. She had underlined it, same as Voss had underlined his note 11 years before her. Some truths keep getting rediscovered. Elias Vaughan died in the 39th year, at the age of 91, in a house on Earth surrounded by his daughter and her children and her children's children, who were loud and full of questions and who had grown up being told the story of the man who walked into the biggest room in 40 star systems with 1 data chip and a translation collar and told the truth. The Vorith Imperial record noted his death. It was the first time a human being had ever been listed in that record. The listing was short. 4 words and 2 numbers, his birth year and the year of his death. Below his name it read, asterisk tier undefined, impact, immeasurable asterisk. Voss, who was very old himself by then and had retired from service but still read the Imperial record every morning, saw the entry and sat with it for a long time. Then he went to find a piece of paper and wrote a new note, the way he had done once before, long ago, after a single strange day when a human had walked into a hall and a princess had gone silent. This note said, asterisk, he was right. They were all right. Asterisk. He underlined it twice, as was his habit with things that mattered. Then he folded it carefully and put it away, and outside his window the morning was bright and wide and full of a future that was still, even now, just beginning.